The scene begins with George and his family moving into a new house that looks more like a horror movie set than a sweet home. Without electricity, at a beautiful sunset, the mother divides a single hamburger into 4 parts for her children. Hungry, George can barely hold back his appetite, but his sister Mary insists that they pray before eating. Reluctantly, George waits, and after the prayer, he devours his portion in 1 bite. Noticing her brother's persistent hunger, Mary generously offers him half of her share, always seeing the best in him. That night, the mother warns George that he cannot afford to fail school again. It would be too difficult to catch up. She begs him to avoid fights at school. The next day, George is the target of stares at school because of his appearance. When he tries to answer a question in class, the teacher ignores him due to his dirty clothes, preferring to call on a student with shiny shoes. "Jason, enlighten us with your wisdom." During lunch, George sits alone without food while his classmates eat, and one of them taunts him, treating him like a dog. "Want this piece of bread? Go fetch." Enraged, George punches the boy and runs away when the teacher arrives. Years later, George and a friend are outside a bar planning to rob a drunk man, but they discover he is an undercover cop. George manages to escape by hiding under a house and covering himself in sewage to avoid being detected by the police dogs. On his way back home, he sees a Job Corps ad on a TV in a shop window, offering free food and drink to dropouts. Excited, George shares the news with his mother, who supports his decision. "You want to do this, Job Corps? Then do it right, George. Don't come running home because you're homesick." A few days later, George arrives at Job Corps in California. There, he immediately clashes with another guy, Desmond, over a bed. George finds a new pair of Converse sneakers in his bag, along with a note from his mother. Desmond watches enviously. George struggles in the electricity class, provoking laughter from the other students, and responds with a threatening look. The next day, Desmond listens to music while George tries to study. Frustrated, George turns off the record player. Desmond offers George a drink, which he refuses, but they end up bonding. In the cafeteria, Desmond reveals that he is responsible for the extra brownies, thanks to his skills with numbers. George notices a guy wearing his stolen sneakers and confronts him, almost throwing him out the window until Doc intervenes. In the car, Doc gives George 2 options: expulsion or prison. George begs for a second chance, and Doc, feeling compassionate, suggests he join the boxing club. George accepts and starts training with Doc, who sees his potential. In the ring, George initially struggles, but with Doc's rigorous training, he quickly improves. Eventually, George faces the opponent who previously knocked him down and defeats him, impressing Doc. On the phone, George tells his mother about boxing, but she disapproves. "I'm not fighting, Mom. It's boxing. It's a sport with rules." George trains hard, and a year later, he faces a more experienced Soviet boxer in the Olympics. Against all odds, George wins the gold medal, making his family and friends proud. Upon returning home, George faces criticism from an old acquaintance who accuses him of not supporting the black athlete's cause. Exhausted from being labeled a traitor, George vents to his mother, who comforts him. Determined to earn everyone's respect, George promises to win the world championship belt. George meets Paula at the airport and they start dating. He continues to train and, with the support of his new team, defeats his opponents one by one. Eventually, George marries Paula and faces Joe Frazier for the heavyweight title. In an exciting fight, George defeats Frazier and becomes the new world champion. During the celebration, George offers Desmond a role as his financial manager and gets involved with a woman he meets at the party. The next day, George watches an interview with Muhammad Ali, who taunts him, sparking his anger. A few months later, George travels to the Democratic Republic of Congo to face Ali, who is adored by the local people. During the fight, Ali taunts George, who quickly tires. In the 8th round, Ali knocks George down, marking his first defeat. This movie was directed by George Tillman Jr. If there's something I wouldn't do in this story, it would be to underestimate the importance of technical training in any sport. If there's something I would do, it would be to value the support of those by my side, like Doc did with George. An ironic reference to Rocky would be fitting, especially considering George's journey from humble beginnings to world champion. It's interesting how George's anger transforms into motivation, showing that even negative feelings can be channeled into something positive. The audience erupts in admiration for the hero Muhammad Ali after his victory, while George reevaluates his life, realizing he was blinded by his aggressive nature. Determined to make amends, he calls his wife, promising never to leave her again. But Paula, hurt and distant, asks for a divorce. Seeking solace, George visits his mother and confesses that he fired Dick and Archie, blaming them for the loss. His mother supports him, but in a bold move to regain his pride, George decides to fight 5 boxers in one day. Doc tries to dissuade him from this crazy idea, and at the event, Muhammad Ali, always the ring clown, joins the commentators while the crowd chants his name. Frustrated and seeking redemption, George challenges Ali to a rematch, starting an argument. Despite the tensions, George defeats all 5 fighters, demonstrating his strength and skill. After the fight, Doc confronts him, questioning what he hoped to gain. The drama is interrupted by urgent news. George's pregnant sister has been hospitalized. At the hospital, George pleads with God to save the baby, offering his own life. The next morning, miraculously, Mary and the baby are fine. During a fight against Jimmy Young, George loses by unanimous decision and faints, believing he heard Jesus' voice. Days later, he is baptized and decides to become a preacher, much to Doc's shock. George visits Muhammad Ali to seek forgiveness, but Ali, always witty, jokes about the situation. After a sincere conversation, they reconcile. George tries to make amends with his ex-wife and children and soon meets Mary, a girl skeptical of his transformation. To prove his sincerity, he preaches outside the church, facing mockery calmly. Mary, impressed, approaches him. Together, they discover an abandoned building, and 7 years later, George fulfills his dream of preaching in his own church, now with a united family. But peace is short-lived. Desmond, his financial manager, invests all the money in high-risk stocks, leaving George broke. Desperate, George resorts to commercials and merchandising to survive. Determined to fight again, he asks Doc for help, who hesitates but is convinced by George's determination. After intense preparation, George returns to the ring, facing Steve Zuski. Although initially hesitant, he dominates the fight, and his triumphant comeback is celebrated. Years later, George faces Evander Holyfield, losing by unanimous decision but securing a huge financial reward. 3 years later, at 45, George challenges champion Michael Moorer. Against all odds, he knocks out Moorer in the 10th round, becoming the oldest champion in history. "We did it," celebrates George. The film reveals that he and Ali became great friends and that Doc was inducted into the World Boxing Hall of Fame in 1998. Today, George continues preaching and running his youth center in Houston. An interesting fact is that in real life, George Foreman named all 5 of his sons George. Something I would definitely not do is fight 5 boxers in one day. That's madness. It's interesting to note how George's transformation from an angry fighter to a peaceful preacher reflects the classic redemption narrative. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.
And I gotta tell you, it was perfect.